When the girl started drowning, the crowd just stood there silently, as if it were a free attraction, not a life-or-death moment. Only a skinny black boy, who clearly wasn't welcome there, dove into the water. And do you know what he got for saving her? Accusations and disdain. But his response to one of the most powerful men in the city was a slap in the face to the entire world. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at the park, the kind where life seemed to run in slow motion. James, a 12-year-old boy from the city's poorest neighborhood, was spending his free time by the pond. The water's surface reflected the late sunlight, and James found comfort in the quiet. His life didn't offer much luxury, holes in his sneakers, hand-me-downs that barely fit. But the park was his escape, his space to breathe. That peace shattered when a piercing scream echoed across the park. James snapped his head toward the sound, his heart sinking. Near the pond, a small white girl was thrashing in the water, her arms flailing wildly. She was going under fast, and the few adults nearby, they were frozen, whispering to each other like they were analyzing a drama instead of witnessing a life-or-death situation. "Somebody help her!" James yelled, his voice sharp with urgency. No one moved. A man scratched his chin, muttering, "Where are her parents?" A woman clutched her purse tighter, whispering, "Such a shame." James didn't wait for their sense of decency to kick in. He sprinted toward the pond, his worn sneakers kicking up dirt. For a kid who could barely swim, this wasn't just brave, it was reckless. The cold water hit him like an electric shock as he dove in, his breath hitching. James fought against the weight of his drenched clothes, his thin arms paddling desperately toward the girl. She had stopped moving by the time he reached her, her face pale, her limbs eerily still. Fear gripped him, but he wrapped his arm around her chest and pulled with everything he had. When James finally dragged her to the shore, he collapsed, gasping for air. His chest burned, his arms ached, but the girl wasn't breathing. Panic rose in his throat. "Somebody call 911, he shouted. The crowd edged closer, their faces filled with suspicion instead of concern. One man sneered, "That kid probably pushed her in, look at him, trouble written all over." James shot him a glare, his hands trembling as he tilted the girl's head back. "She's dying. And that's what you're worried about, seriously?" Ignoring the murmurs, James checked for a pulse. It was faint, almost non-existent. His hands shook as he tried to remember what he'd seen on TV about CPR. Before he could start, a voice in the crowd cut through the tension. "He's just a kid, he probably doesn't know what he's doing." James had had enough. He lifted the girl into his arms, her body limp against him. "If you're not going to help, then get out of my way," he snapped, his voice filled with fury and desperation. The hospital wasn't far, but the journey felt endless. Each step was a battle against exhaustion and the weight of his soaking clothes. James pushed forward, his legs trembling, his breath ragged. He refused to let go even when his arm screamed in protest. When he burst into the emergency room, soaked and shivering, his voice was raw. "She's not breathing. Please help her," he cried. The medical staff didn't hesitate. They took the girl from his arms, placing her on a stretcher and wheeling her away. One nurse asked James what happened, but his words came out in jumbled fragments. "She was in the pond, drowning. No one helped." The nurse nodded, her expression softening, and left to join the others. James sank into a nearby chair, his body numb. He ignored the stares from the people around him, their whispers sharp and accusing. "Who's that kid? Looks like trouble. Maybe he was involved." James clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. They didn't know him and they didn't care, but none of it mattered. The girl was in safe hands now, and that was all he cared about. Without waiting for thanks or explanations, James stood, wrung out his shirt, and walked out into the fading sunlight. His job was done, or so he thought. The hospital was a scene of quiet chaos when Richard Holmes arrived. His black luxury car pulled up like it didn't belong, gleaming against the worn-down pavement. Inside, Richard was far from his usual composed self. His daughter was in the emergency room, and the details he had so far were maddeningly vague. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice sharp as he marched into the reception area. A nurse intercepted him, her expression calm but urgent. "She's stable now, Mr. Holmes. A boy brought her in just in time." That stopped him cold. "A boy? What boy?" She described James, a soaked, shivering 12-year-old who had carried his unconscious daughter through the hospital doors. He didn't stick around, just handed her over and left. Richard's chest tightened. This kid had risked his life to save his daughter, and he didn't even wait for recognition? For thanks? "You're telling me no one knows who he is? No one stopped him?" The nurse shook her head. "We were focused on her condition." Richard took a slow breath, his mind already working. "Fine, I'll find him myself." James, meanwhile, was back at home. The Southside district wasn't the kind of place people cared about. Cracked sidewalks, peeling paint on the apartment doors, and a lingering smell of exhaust fumes. It was just how life was. James had tried to brush off the events of the day, but it lingered in his mind. His mom, Denise, took one look at him when he walked in. "James Carter, why are you dripping water all over my floor?" "I fell," he mumbled, hoping she wouldn't press further. Denise crossed her arms. "Fell? Into what, the ocean? Go change before you get sick." James nodded and headed to his room. He couldn't tell her the truth, not yet. She worked too hard to keep their lives together, and he didn't want her worrying. But as he sat on his bed drying off, the girl's pale face haunted him. He had done everything he could. That had to be enough. Richard's search was relentless. By morning, his team had pieced together a description of the boy from park witnesses and hospital footage. It didn't take long to connect the dots. "His name's James Carter," the investigator told Richard. "Lives in Southside." Richard was already on his feet. "Get the car, we're going." When they pulled up to James's building, it was clear this wasn't a place Richard was accustomed to. Faded graffiti covered the walls, and the air carried a mix of fried food and gasoline. He climbed the stairs to the apartment, knocking sharply. Denise answered, her eyes narrowing at the sight of a man in an expensive suit. "Can I help you?" "Mrs. Carter, I'm Richard Holmes. Your son saved my daughter's life yesterday." Denise blinked, processing the words. "Saved? What do you mean?" Before Richard could respond, James appeared behind her, looking cautious. He recognized the man immediately from TV and newspapers. "Mom, it's okay. He's talking about the girl from the park." Richard stepped forward. "You're James. You saved my daughter." His voice softened. "I don't know how to thank you, but I want to help you. Anything you need, just name it." James hesitated, his eyes meeting Richard's. His answer would leave the man speechless. Richard Holmes wasn't a man who struggled for words. As a millionaire, he thrived on quick thinking and solutions. But standing in the modest living room of James Carter, the boy who had saved his daughter's life, he found himself humbled. James stood before him, his wiry frame engulfed in an oversized hoodie. His mother, Denise, was still trying to process everything. "Wait, you're saying my son saved your daughter?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Richard nodded. "He didn't just save her, he risked his life for her, and I want to repay him." Denise looked at James, pride and concern flickering in her eyes. "Is this true, James?" James shrugged. "She needed help. No one else was doing anything. What was I supposed to do, just stand there?" Richard's lips twitched. "Most people would have." "Well," James replied, crossing his arms, "most people are useless." Richard chuckled despite himself. "Fair point. But James, I mean it. Whatever you want, money, a scholarship, something for your family, just ask." James hesitated, glancing at his mother before meeting Richard's gaze. His expression was unreadable, his voice steady when he finally spoke. "I don't want money or anything fancy. But if you really want to thank me, help fix things, not for me, but for kids like me." Richard blinked. "Fix things? What do you mean?" "I mean the way people look at us," James said, his voice firm. "Yesterday, when I saved your daughter, nobody helped. They looked at me like I was a criminal, like I didn't belong. If you want to thank me, use your money to change that." The room went quiet. Denise covered her mouth, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Richard was stunned. He had expected a material request, something tangible. Instead, this boy from the poorest part of town had asked for something far greater. "You're asking me to fight prejudice?" Richard finally managed. James nodded. Yeah. Make it so kids like me don't get ignored or judged just because of how we look. Richard's chest tightened. This was more than just a request, it was a challenge, and for the first time in years he felt truly moved. You're remarkable, he said quietly. I promise you, James. I'll do everything I can. James shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. Just don't make it a big deal or put my name on it. I don't need that. Richard nodded, already thinking about how to channel his resources into something meaningful. He had spent years building his empire, but now he knew he could use it for something far more important. In the weeks that followed, Richard launched a foundation aimed at providing opportunities for underprivileged kids and fighting systemic biases. True to his word, he never mentioned James by name, respecting the boy's humility. As for James, he returned to his quiet life, but deep down he carried a quiet pride. He hadn't just saved a life, he had sparked a change that could impact countless others.